All right, guys. This is really exciting. I have information all the way up to Joseph, so we'll see how much it'll actually how it'll go, the whole process of everything here. So let's go ahead and give it to God, and then we'll just continue from there. So, Father, thank you. This is really, really crazy how it is so clear that you have absolutely directed this study. I just sit down for an hour and all of this information just pours out. It's interesting to see like how it's crazy, like just to think of how much information we have to cover. And it's really, really in your hands. It is obvious that you want this message to be shared. It's obvious that you want us to break down these barriers that we create for ourselves in these modern times and that we've created throughout the millennia. Father, we just put ourselves in your hands. We put everything that we go with this knowledge that we're studying. We just put everything in your hands, and we just ask that you continue to open our eyes the way that our eyes are supposed to be opened, and that we continue to listen to your voice as we study. Father, we thank you for these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. There are a few things that were raised to me throughout the week, and I think it's important to be able to review those things before we go any further in starting with Genesis 17. So I'm going to, first of all, I'll say this. So when we were talking about like the whole Garden of Eden narrative, it was funny because when I was at church this past Sunday, it was funny because God was just like really kind of like downloading a whole bunch of information into my head, as well as Linda's and as well as Rusty's, and it was really cool, like a really cool experience. And we were talking about the concept of the Garden of Eden. And when you think of Christ as the second Adam and we are the second Eve, it's really amazing when you think that when Christ died, we were talking about God's mercy when he said, if you eat of this fruit, then you will die. Like on the day that you eat that fruit, that you will die. It's funny because Christ, when he dies, he says, I tell you this day that we will be in paradise. And Linda sent me an interesting tidbit about the Jewish Bible, and I looked it up. The Hebrew translation of the Greek does read the Garden of Eden. So when Christ says that I tell you this day you will join me in the Garden of Eden. And it's interesting that it's like on this day you take of this fruit you will die versus on this day you will be with me in the Garden of Eden. I thought that was a really beautiful way of looking at it. As well as Christ is the second Adam. And when he tells Adam and Eve that on this day you will die, instead what happens is he selects Christ, his one and only son, which will be a major theme in what we cover. His one and only son is sacrificed in that sense, and he dies in Adam's stead. And when we as Christians accept Christ and we are put under the water, we die under the water, which was interesting when you think of Noah and everything like that. And we die in Eve's stead because we, as a collective body, are the second Eve. And I thought that was a really interestingly poetic way of looking at things. As well as, I'm just looking here, it's really fascinating because, like, to me, and it really kind of, like, dawned on me that, like, I've heard of the Bible as being, like, an entire narrative of getting to the kingdom, like how the whole entire story is how we lose the Garden of Eden and how we gain it back at the end. I've also come across things like how the Bible Project, for example, talks about things like saying that it's a unified story that leads to Jesus. I mean, both of these are true. I think it's also important to note, too, that I personally have come to view it as Christ himself, like putting himself on one knee and basically saying to us, will you marry me? And it's a really powerful concept because, like, the entire story is how can we look at these narratives, look at this poetry, look at all of this combined, and then we're faced with the decision: will we choose to take, what fruit will we choose to take from? And if we choose to take of the tree of life, what are we willing to become married with Christ? And I think it's a really beautiful way of looking at things. Yeah?
Oh, in that sense, then, like the poetic sections, the God speaking, it's, in the Bible is kind of like love letters.
Yeah.
His love letters to us.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And absolutely, it's funny. I also was thinking about like Song of Songs, and because at church, before we go into worship service, we are studying the Song of Songs, and I've heard it beautifully put by some scholar, and it was referenced later in a podcast, but I've heard it before, is that maybe from that Holy, I don't remember, but that when you read the Song of Songs, you are entering the Holy of Holies. And it's yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that, and all that poetry has to do with that. Yep. Any other comments before we move on to other concepts here?
The eyes.
No. Okay.
The eyes have it.
But reflecting again on the Garden of Eden, Linda also brought up 2 Peter 3:10. I'm sorry, not the Garden of Eden, but regarding Noah. And in 2 Peter 3, let me pull it up here. It talks about Noah, and it talks about like how it says, starting in verse 4, they will say, what happened to the promise that Jesus is coming again? From before the times of our ancestors, everything has remained the same since the world was first created. They deliberately forget that God made the heavens long ago by the word of his command. And he brought the earth out from the water and surrounded it with water. Then he used the water to destroy the ancient world with a mighty flood. And by the same word, the present heavens and earth have been stored up for fire. They are being kept for the day of judgment when ungodly people will be destroyed. But you must not forget this one thing, dear friends. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day. The Lord isn't really being slow about his promise, as some people think. No, he is being patient for your sake. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants everyone to repent. But the day of the Lord will come as unexpectedly as a thief. Then the heavens will pass away with a terrible noise, and the very elements themselves will disappear in fire, and the earth and everything on it will be found to deserve judgment. Since everything around us is going to be destroyed like this, what holy and godly lives in you should live, looking forward to the day of God and hurrying it along. On that day he will set the heavens on fire, and the elements will melt away in the flames. But we are looking forward to the new heavens and new earths he has promised, a world filled with God's righteousness. And so, dear friends, while you're waiting for these things to happen, make every effort to be found living peaceful lives that are pure and blameless in his sight. And remember, our Lord's patience gives people time to be saved. This is what our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom God gave him. And so, real quick, let's go back to Genesis 8 as well, the very last 2 verses of Genesis 8. And there it says, and the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race. Even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood, I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. There are a couple of things that I'll bring up first, and then I'll open it up for discussion. And I was talking with Mom about this yesterday. When it says, as long as the earth remains, there is the caveat, is that when there's a new heavens and a new earth, will these things pass away? And it does talk about, like, the former will pass away, bringing about the renewal of things. I think, personally, it's up for discussion on that. But as long as this domain exists, I guess you could, before the coming of the ushering in of the kingdom, I would say that, for that amount of time, this world will not be destroyed. When it talks about the fire, though, I've also raised the point that God is often described as an unquenchable fire, a consuming fire. Yeah, and when his presence was among the Israelites, he basically blasted them away if they had any impurities found within them. And it wasn't because he didn't love them. It was more like, if you didn't obey these commands, like when you got close to him, you couldn't help but be incinerated by him. And that was the problem. And so when things got to the point of Christ, like that veil tore. Then you had like the apostles who had fire hover over them and enter them, and that was the beginning of the Spirit living within them. And that and that also equated to a fire. And so when it's talking about the elements will pass away, I personally also equate it to like when we become Christians, our old selves are kind of burned away in the process of us becoming new people. And when you think of the arrival of the heavens and the earth, there is a physical separation between the modern day heaven and the modern day earth, like the biblical conception of it. There is a separation, similar to a veil. And so that fire, the way I read the 2 Peter 3, it seems as if like God is merging the two, and by such, like everything that we know will just be burned away in that sense, as everything is merging together. It's possible. It's absolutely possible that means everything will just be consumed. I don't necessarily know what my belief is on this. But I do think, though, that there's a lot of imagery and a lot of other biblical passages that do relate to it. Like in Revelation 20 and 21, is like when those things will pass away, but yet there's also that fire, the fire of purification, where silver can get better through the fire. And it's like that's exact. And like how Rusty talks about like the stick figure within us, because like the rest of it is like it's thrown away like straw, or chaff. Yeah, sorry, I mix up chaff and chafe, so it's thrown away like chaff. And it's really interesting imagery, and I believe it's similar. So I'm open for discussion on that if anyone wants to comment on anything like that.
I had a comment about something similar.
Mm-hmm.
I watch a lot of YouTube, and there's a man that makes crystals out of Pepto-Bismol tablets.
Okay.
By melting it down. And melting it down, and melting it down. He just keeps melting it down until it finally makes crystals.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah.
It's like a transformation process.
It's actually, the crystals are actually like very beautiful.
Yeah, I get
Is
that.
Is that kind of what you were talking about?
Similar. Like with the whole silver passing through the fire, it's like silver can't be refined until it's passed through fire. Yeah, right. It's similar. It's exactly it's a similar concept.
It's the same kind of chemical.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Or not the same kind of chemical, but a same type of process.
Yes.
A similar type of process.
Yes, that's what I meant.
What?
I'm checking something real quick. I have an idea.
Dad, I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but I didn't know if you had a comment or not, or anyone else.
Well, nothing to really add.
Okay. Go ahead.
The process of purification through fire is constant throughout the scriptures, from Genesis to Revelation. And it's like what Paul, like basically what you said. There's nothing really to elaborate much on.
Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead, Mom.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering. This is just a thought. Nothing in concrete, but just a thought. That he says that God said, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, and nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done." And then while the earth remains, and I was kind of wondering if the fire might be like you said, or like a purification type of thing, and then the recreation of the heavens and earth, like out of the tohu vabohu of the fire, in that purification, and he's bringing new heavens and new earth, and the earth's not going to cease to exist. It's just going to be recreated, like it was in the beginning, but out of that cleansing.
I mean, think about it. When we become Christians, we become renewed. We're still ourselves, but different and more.
Gold tried in the fire.
Right. Exactly. It's just like, I think that's similar imagery when you're talking about the new earth, the new heavens. When it says the new heavens and the new earth, basically what it's saying is it's all one. It's all put together. And so it's like, so in that process, with everything becoming one like that, I do believe it's similar to when, I think our lives as Christians are previews of coming attractions when it comes to that. How we, as part of this creation, are renewed in that respect. So, anything else, anyone? Even disagreement. I am not opposed to disagreement either. This is stuff where I do not necessarily have all the answers here.
Okay, then I'll disagree.
Okay, go ahead. Just disagree.
Disagree.
I had a quick thing then about Melchizedek. So I did talk about before the meaning of the name, which is righteousness is my king. And I'm paralleling this to Joshua 10, the beginning of Joshua 10, where it says Adonai Zedek, which actually means my righteousness is my Lord. And I thought I think it's interesting to pair this, but Adonai Zedek isn't that great of a character. But but I did want to share that, like, sometimes the names have meaning, and we will be delving into some of the more important ones, but they're not always indicative. And it's quite clear that Adonai Zedek did not truly consider righteousness as his king, or as his Lord. So it is interesting how sometimes the names really are kind of like tongue-in-cheek. Similar to Ruth, when at the beginning of Ruth you have two sons that die, and one of them is named the sickly one, and the other one is named the one that's going to die. And it's funny. We actually talked about that, I think, in Hebrew classes last week. Yeah, this past Sunday. And it was funny because it's like, yeah, who would ever name their kids these things? But, yeah, it is cool. But any other comments before we delve into Genesis 17?
Yeah, we talked about the circumcision.
Oh, I did have that written. Why did I not see that? It was right there. It was right there. And shame on me. Yes. Yes. Okay, please, go ahead, Mom.
I was thinking of this last week, and I didn't have it formulated enough in my head to bring it out. But that being my own problem, because sometimes I just have to gel things a little bit. But the circumcision, it could be kind of like a reminder of something that Abram had done wrong, but I kind of wonder if it wasn't also symbolic of the removal of a veil. Like when the apostles talked about the circumcision of the heart, circumcise your hearts, and not necessarily mutilation of the body, but to circumcise the heart. And Jesus removed that veil between us and God. Mm-hmm. And with Abram being the father of the people that Christ came from, I'm wondering if that may have been, it could have been or could not have been. I was just wondering, to me it seems kind of like symbolic of the removal of the veil between God and the people.
We're talking about the purification fire before too, and I think that goes into in the same realm of when our hearts become circumcised. But you said something about Abraham doing something wrong. I don't remember mentioning that before.
Yeah, you talked about reminding him of Hagar.
Did I?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, you're saying that bad things came from.
Oh no! Yeah, bad things did come from that, but I don't think. If I said that, I did not mean that. Okay. I never meant that. I actually did not. I hope I didn't say that. I'll have to review that. So, what were you saying, Dad?
I think I might have mentioned that too. That some people say that Abraham, because of the situation that he wasn't trusting in God to produce a child. And
we are going to talk about how Abraham did not trust God. We are, but I never, I never equated personally in my head. This is like the first time I've heard of it. I never equated the circumcision having anything to do with Hagar in that regard. I always viewed it as more like the sign of the covenant. So if I stated that somehow offhandedly, that was not intentional.
Well,
but you have to.
it's a sign of the covenant, but it could have other significance as well. I think the Bible Project talks about that as well, if I remember right.
Perhaps. I would have to check that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you have to love God, though. I mean, even though Abram was a person just like all of us, and and of course, tongue in cheek, you have to love God. I mean, we better, but and we should. But His mercy and the way He looks at things, he's forgiving, and He just covers up like things that we do.
Right. Okay. That might.
And He removes them from His mind too, like calling David a man after His own heart. And yet, David had severe problems like we all do.
Right. Where I think you're going, okay, now I think I know what I might have said, is the removal is the opposite action of what God did to Adam and Eve. He crafted skins for them to wear. Mm-hmm. And so here he is removing that, in a sense. He is kind of revealing Abraham's nakedness in that sense. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they do get what you're saying there. Yep. Okay. Another thing, too, that you talked about in the car, we were going off in the car somewhere. We were talking. We were talking about how Abraham was more than likely like a higher class, like a person of authority, or something like with at least some sort of like high esteem among the community.
He was a wealthy person to start with. He came from a
right. Yeah. And then God said, "Up and go." Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Which was another thing when he told Abraham to get up and leave your parents and your family and go to another place. That was significant because he's leaving a comfortable environment. And
I'm guessing that his family was pretty significant because I was watching a documentary this week, and it was talking about the fall actually of Sumer, of and of in Sumer, and I'm wondering. I haven't gone back and checked the timeline yet, but I'm wondering if Terah was a person of enough significance and wealth that when the problems were in the land, if this was around the same time that was having difficulties, which it may or may not be, I'm just saying. But at whichever given point Terah left the land, he had the resources to pick up his family and go.
That's true.
And that was a major deal then.
That's true.
And he took his whole family and went. So they were probably pretty well off and people of significance in the land. And Abram, my guess is he was very well educated in the Chaldean type mysteries, even, and knowledge.
I would say so because of the fact that he kept building altars. It's just weird to me that like there's like an altar there, 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 and an altar there. It is very much, I guess you could say, heavily emphasized in scripture.
And also, he knew how to comport himself with princes.
That's another thing.
He was comfortable in that situation, so he knew how to deal with people of authority. So my guess is he was not unfamiliar with that.
You knew how you had to lie to the king about your sister being your wife.
Oh,
yeah, but why in the world was Pharaoh talking to Abram? It's like had to have been significant.
Yep, I agree.
It's the court politics.
Yeah.
No, I do agree. Okay, anything else? I got one. Being afraid is going to be a major concept in what we're going to be covering for a little while here. And we've been talking about what fear of the Lord is. And so here we're going to be looking at several instances of fear. And it is the same word in Hebrew. People have talked about the different nuances of fear. But just to reiterate, the word, just like in English, is the same. Or derivations of the same word. Similar to how we have fear, so F and R, but versus afraid, like the FR in the middle of that. It's similar things happen in Hebrew, but it is also the same composition, and we will be talking about that today. All right, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at Genesis 17. So, so we left off right around verse 15. Now, this is where I'm going to start pulling back a little bit more. And we're going to be looking at certain concepts, and looking at the threads of interesting themes that are being parsed throughout the entire reading. So all of us have gone through the Bible before. So we know what the stories are saying. And for anyone who is reading or watching online, feel free to read these things first before we come back and cover them. So yeah, and here we go. I'm going to start in verse 19 because this is talking about the laughter thing going on here. And but God replied, "No, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac," and which means he will laugh, or he laughs. Trying to translate a single Hebrew verb is sometimes difficult, okay? So he will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. And then as for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you have asked. I will make him extremely fruitful and multiply his descendants. He will become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Last quick thing. Is in verse 18, so 2 verses up, where it says, "So Abraham said to God, may Ishmael live under your special blessing." So Abraham's already given God not a consolation, but some sort of, I guess you could say his own personal compromise, because he doesn't believe that Sarah would be able to provide an heir. And the Lord is saying, no, listen to me here. I am telling you that your wife, Sarah, will have a son. You're going to name him Isaac. I will bless Ishmael too. But this is where it's starting to get into the whole trusting thing with God. God has already said this before. And now by this point, Ishmael had already been born. And Abraham did view Ishmael as that heir of sorts. Now, one thing I do want to mention, and it's very important, is talking about the 12 princes, or kings that come from Ishmael's line. Please understand that the Bible is not saying that Ishmael is a terrible person. I have unfortunately come across certain traditions that believe that the 12 princes, and it could very well be indicative of the 12 Imams, of Islam. It's very potentially true. But I do think it's clear to mention here that it's like that Islam is not being perceived as the bitter enemy. And this is well before Islam was even in existence. And I think what's interesting is, unfortunately, it seems as if in modern times, Christianity and Islam have come to butt heads so much. It does say that Ishmael became like a warrior of the myth, but it does say that Ishmael became like a warrior, and that he was kind of like what did it say? Like a wild donkey. But that it's not saying, though, that we should forever be against him. Instead, God says the complete opposite. And I think it's very important. Yes, Ed?
Well, isn't the Muslims came 600 some AD? So Ishmael had really nothing to do with that. And if any traditions that the Muslims or Islamics would have, they might be taking scripture out and saying, okay, here are the 12 Imams or something. But the Bible's not saying that. They're just interpreting that probably for their own ends, or trying to make sense of their own situations.
Yep, I agree with you. And I think it's an unfortunate twisting of the word. To meet, once again, to see things the way that we deem fit. And I think it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, the thing is, people have human nature back then just like they do now, and they're competitive with each other. So even though they're related and they're half-brothers and cousins and that type of thing, they want the other guy's land, or they want their produce or whatever. You know, so there's always going to be conflict, and it's just human nature. It's the nature of man.
You see it in Genesis here. You absolutely see it in the Genesis narrative. It's everywhere. I think that's why Genesis is so crucial, because it's saying this is what humans do.
Right, exactly.
And yet it's like us falling into a trap when it comes to that. But yeah, it is interesting. It's like, once again, it goes back to that Ouroboros cycle that just never ends.
Yep.
But anyway, cool. All right. Anything else on that before I go further?
Nope.
Okay. Next, that I just wanted to state there. I think the rest of the chapter is relatively self-explanatory. Believe me when I say, you can pick apart every portion of Scripture. I think it's evident and it's clear. But I think more importantly here, for this type of study, that we really hammer down a few of the core concepts. So I think, honestly, it's pretty clear what goes on here. So let's go ahead and go to chapter 18, verses 10 to 15. Does anyone want to read that? 10 to 15 in chapter 18. I'll read it. Then one of them said, I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, how could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old? Then the Lord said to Abram, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. But the Lord said, no, you did laugh. Actually, and it goes down, so it's funny. Wait a second, where's the other thing? There's something about the naming of Isaac. But it seems as if, remember, it means he laughs or he will laugh. But anyway, it's funny that the whole... Oh, I did want to make a clarification. It is clear, but just for clarification purposes, there are three men that go to see Abram. One of them is designated as the Lord. And then when there are two that take Lot and his family out of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, or out of the hellfires of Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's definitely, it is interesting to pinpoint there that the Lord definitely made an appearance in physical form. And I think it was called the angel of the Lord here. I might be wrong here. It just says the Lord. And I do believe it came across as his name at one point in this discourse. So, all right, that's what I got with that. And then we have 23 to the end, which I'll just go ahead and read. Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? Suppose you find 50 righteous people living there in the city. Will you still sweep it away and not spare it for their sake? Surely you wouldn't do such a thing, destroying the righteous along with the wicked. Why? Why you would be treating the righteous and the wicked exactly the same? Surely you wouldn't do that. Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right? And the Lord replied, if I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake. And it goes on, and you get them all the way down to 10. And it's clear here that it's making it a clear distinction that you can negotiate with God, especially when it pleases him. And it does please him to be part of a conversation. This to me is evidence of how God does not want a domineering partnership with us. He does not want that domineering relationship. He doesn't want to be like this domineering, I think is the best way to say it. And I think you understand what I mean. He actually invites conversation. He invites discussion. Remember what going back to what I said, this entire thing is kind of like him saying, will you marry me? It's like, no, true, like, genuine husband in a relationship is going to just, like, not listen whatsoever to what a wife has to say. Instead, there's the invitation of talking. Same thing happens with Moses as well. The Lord says, I'm too angry, don't talk to me. And then Moses kind of, like, paused them, and it happens. There's a time when Moses kind of, like, gets a little bit, I guess you could say, he doesn't believe in himself enough, and the Lord gets angry at that. It's funny because it's almost like you have like these two people who love each other very, very much, but who sometimes have that little bit of like either somewhat conflict or that type of loving relationship where they're willing to listen to each other. And I think it's exemplary here as well. Anyone have any comments before we move on? Okay, chapter 19, verses 8 to 9. I have, look, this is Lot speaking. Look, I have 2 virgin daughters. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them as you wish. But please, leave these men alone, for they are my guests and are under my protection. Stand back, they shouted. This fellow came to town as an outsider, and now he's acting like our judge. We'll treat you far worse than those other men. And they lunged toward Lot to break down the door. First of all, let's talk about the meaning of the word judge, because Abraham just called the Lord the judge of all the earth. So what does it mean? Does anyone know the implication of being a judge in those ancient times?
I think it could also be considered a chieftain type of like a tribe or a clan or something like that.
What does a judge uphold?
The law, the rules, justice.
Justice and righteousness.
Yeah.
They'll make sure that righteousness is maintained. And so Abraham, when he's talking to the Lord, he's basically saying, are you not going to uphold the values of justice and righteousness? Like, so are you going to destroy the wicked as well as the righteous? And in here, the people of Sodom are saying to Lot, are you telling us, are you telling us how to be righteous in a sense? Like, do you seem to think that you know what good and evil is? Or how to rightly justify what righteousness or true justice is. And that's interesting. First of all, because Lot offers his 2 daughters. And even in those times, like offering 2 virgin daughters was a big deal. If you look at Dinah later, that whole situation that goes now, yes, granted, she was raped, but what Lot is doing is he's offering his 2 virgin daughters to be raped by the people of Sodom. And it's really interesting that you have Lot here doing that, and then you have that sort of, and they obviously clash. And then you have like the sons of Jacob who would say like, we're not going to allow our daughter to, our sister to act like a prostitute. It was a huge deal what Lot was doing. And in truth, like when you look at it through the eyes of I guess you could say godly righteousness, it wasn't a good thing to do either. So anyone, it sounds like you had something to say.
Yeah, that's just the dichotomy of what happened with Lot here. I think that I wonder if at that particular point he knew that these men were angels. I'm wondering if at this very point he knew that, but even if he didn't, it shows that the rules of hospitality then, especially where men were concerned. I don't mean to sound like feminist type on that, but the rules with hospitality, you did not treat a guest with disrespect, and he had invited them in off the street to stay with him. He had shown his hospitality. And when the people of the city gathered around to rough them up, or to put it mildly, the rules of that's what they wanted. Yeah, the rules of hospitality were such that he was almost forced to offer his daughters to them to put them off, because the hospitality to those men was more important than his
own daughters.
home, his own daughters, his home. Just like in the story in Judges where the Levite had the concubine and the men surrounded the house, and the old guy that had the house put his concubine, but that was a breach of hospitality too, so that's dichotomatic in a way. So when we get there, I guess we'll talk about that. But the Lot was up against, so you kind of wonder, he had to kind of have an inkling that these weren't normal men.
Perhaps, but then again,
or possibly that they were just important men and they were to be respected. And,
yeah.
Especially guests, and they were obviously they weren't just the run-of-the-mill guys. There were some quote-unquote noble type people. If not, if that's assuming he doesn't know they were angels. But yeah, I think it's interesting though. And a few days later, the tables turned on Lot and his daughters, and it's interesting the morality that they had. Yeah.
Oh, you hit it. You really hit something there.
Yeah.
He offers his daughters, and yet he receives them.
Yep. I have a feeling Lot's moral level wasn't the standard that you would think it would be. Honestly.
But you didn't know when they came in with him. That's an important facet.
No, what I'm just saying, you get influenced by the people you live around, the society you're in, and if he was living in Sodom and Gomorrah for that many years, I'm sure his standards got decreased as the longer he stayed there.
Yeah, but historically too, the hospitality to men.
Oh, sure.
Really goes far and away beyond how you treated a woman.
Of course.
Where a woman's importance is concerned.
Mm-hmm. But then you have Queen of Sheba.
Second class.
That's different.
Well, that's noble women. That's a different thing. A royal woman is different. Just a regular non-royal type woman is different than royalty. All these double standards.
True. Oh, and it's funny too, Jezebel. She was treated very well. But she is also nobility. But I got one too. It is that when he said, "Don't," oh my goodness, did I just lose it because we were in this conversation? Hold on, let me just think for a second. I had a point and I totally lost it. Give me a minute.
You can't use getting old as part of that. That's my excuse. Had a senior moment.
I totally lost it. But it had to do with the messengers. It had to do with the men. And it was big. Because you guys were talking about something, and I thought it was important enough, so just give me a second. Because you were talking about how, you were bringing up a point, Dad, about this huge concept of Sodom. If it comes back, I will write it down.
You mean the morality of them, and why God wanted to destroy them? Something along those lines you're talking about, or?
No, it had to do with something earlier in the text where he says, "Look, I have 2 virgin daughters. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them as you wish. But please leave these men alone for my guests." If I remember it, I will jot it down for next week because I thought it was a major point, and it was something I did intend to say, and I forget. But it had to.
I just noticed something here too. I never noticed before.
Please.
In verse 8, when he offered his daughters, in the New King James it says, "You may do to them as you wish, only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof." I never noticed before that he was basically telling, that's why they said, "So what, are you a judge over us?" Mm-hmm. He brought them into his house because he was telling them, "I knew what you were going to pull with them, so I took them into my house so you couldn't."
Mm-hmm.
I never noticed that before. So that's the reason they've come here. I knew that. I brought them in, so you can't have them.
I still can't remember what I wanted to say, but I remember it was important. And this one, I'll have to jot down whenever I get the chance. We'll just have to go on. But yeah, that is, yeah, for this reason that they have come here. All right.
Mine says, look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. I will give them to you, and you may do anything you want with them. But please don't do anything to these men. They have come to my house, and I must protect them.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were talking about like the standards of like hospitality. Yeah. Oh, that's what it was. I finally remembered.
Yay.
Like finally, like because I was talking about the hospitality. Think of we were talking about how important those guests must have been. Thank goodness I remembered. I can't help but think of Jacob when Shechem like took Dinah, and Shechem was like a tribal leader, if not a king. I think he might be a king, and it's definitely a chieftain. And he and then he fell in love with Dinah, and he wanted her. And it's funny because it's like, yeah, so in Jacob's eyes, Shechem was a pretty big deal, and he yelled at his sons for committing such a heinous crime against his name. And it's a similar mindset that Lot had when you come to that, but not Dinah's brothers. And it's interesting because it's like any of this be considered good in the eyes of the Lord? It's becoming distorted. Our concepts of morality are becoming distorted by this point. So
that's what men are choosing good and evil.
Right, exactly. And it's like there is no good choice in that.
Well, I think the thing with Jacob and his sons who went and killed all those poor people suffering in the tribe there, the thing what Jacob was concerned about was the people. He was a stranger in a strange land, and he thought the local tribes were going to come after him because he was just a small company of people. He wasn't even 120 people at the time.
Right, he was afraid.
Right, he was afraid of what could happen to him. They were looking out for his own skin.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that his sons had gone a long ways towards starting a blood feud.
Oh, yeah. And the thing is the guy wanted to make it right. He just didn't want to intermarry with a non-Israelite family. Although that doesn't make any sense either if you think about it, because there was only a small population pool of Israelite people at the time.
Mm.
Right? So how you were going to have to take some foreigners.
Well, it was relatively small because remember there were times when they're too great for us. But yeah. But yeah. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay. Then we have verse 11. Then they blinded all the men, young and old, who were at the door of the house, so they gave up trying to get inside. This is the first mention of someone going blind. And it's interesting because, remember, we're talking about sight. It's definitely connected. And it basically, they can't see what they desire anymore. It's really cool when you think about that.
You're talking about Adam and Eve. They saw the fruit that it was good for the eyes, so they reached out
and saw the messengers and saw that they were good for the taste as well. Same thing with Sarah doing the same thing with Hagar. And so here they're blinded. They can't see what they desire.
Yep.
So it's interesting. Then we have 18 to 21. I'm looking at my notes because today I read through all the text and I was putting out the things I wanted to mention. Yes, they say go over there, and then Lot says, "Oh no, my lord, Lot begged, you have been so gracious to me and saved my life, and you have shown such great kindness, but I cannot go to the mountain.
I don't want to go that far.
Disaster would catch up to me there, and I would soon die. Sorry, guys. To me, that's like a comical thing there. It's really comical.
The one thing that I always got... Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's true. What's that?
I think the other thing I think is I think like living in the city. And if you notice, because he says here, see, now this is a city near enough to flee, and it's a little one. You know, so can I live in that little city? It's not the big one. That, you know, I think he was a city boy.
And I would
necessarily say to be out away from it all.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, true. But the thing is, though, it's like I do believe that it goes back to that whole thing with Moses saying, "Oh, I can't talk, but yet you're sending me." Similar to Lot, like, go over into the mountains. Oh, I can't make it that far because disaster is going to come upon me. They just rescued you from disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's cool. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. And I love how. Sorry, what?
I said he was negotiating.
Absolutely. Yes. And in this negotiation did form a compromise as well. That little village was not destroyed as a result. And anyway, so the fire and the burning stuff.
Yeah, I have just had a thought.
Yeah.
Lot went over there because his herdsmen and his herds were too many to share the land with Abram.
Mm-hmm.
And he went, where were the herds and the shepherds? They had to be around there somewhere. I don't think they'd all be in the city.
They were probably sitting. They probably took the sheep and put them in the city green or something, right? Like they did in.
Well, I'm wondering if they didn't sell them off and live in the city.
That might have been.
But
there is detail.
No, there isn't. I'm just wondering
if
he had out of the city.
Or he could have been living in the city and had his people out there taking care of his flocks out in the field. You know?
I'm actually wondering. Bear with me. Are we missing the forest for the trees? Because this is us getting into the detail of things, and the detail's not provided.
I understand. I understand that. What I'm saying is, the point of interest to me is like, wait a minute. He had all kinds of flocks and herds. Where'd they go?
He did.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just
what your mother's saying is they had to divide because the sheep and their herdsmen were getting conflicts and problems.
Yeah,
so they go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and what happened to the herdsmen? Were they still there, or did he just sell them off to somebody and live in the city?
Because when the angels took their hand, they only took a few people with them. And
I understand. But I'm talking about prior to that incident. Did he liquidate his assets and live in the city, or did he continue to have those assets outside the city, in the field someplace?
I'm guessing he did because he fathered two nations. You know, I mean, I don't think he was poor.
Well, the thing is, after Sodom and Gomorrah got struck, there was nothing left of his assets, was there? How were they born?
I know, because I'm just
they were out in incest. But what I'm saying is, though, he didn't. I mean, he lived somehow.
True.
So his assets were probably outside of the city, but he lived in the city often.
Or that he had a name for himself. And this is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think. I personally feel as if, regardless of the fact, it's clear that, the story is saying that he left with essentially nothing from the city.
Right.
Even I think it was the sons-in-law or something like that, they were left behind because they didn't believe in they last.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. They laughed, they died. Sarah laughed, just can't trust Isaac. So the difference is there. But anyway, all right. Then you have the incest story at the end of the chapter.
Yep.
And Dad, you were, and I've heard this before, thinking that they thought that they were the only people left on Earth. It's clearly not the case because they went to a village.
Right.
And so it is interesting that the daughters felt compelled to maintain their father's name through having children with him. And here it goes back to the concept of wine drinking. Remember in other creation stories and other world foundation stories that drinking wine was considered good. And here it's making a clear distinction that that's not the case. And even the Romans and Greeks had a concept that incest was bad. That was a huge. That's where the Titans came from, one of them, and they were through incestuous relations. It was the Titans. They were through an incestuous relationship. But here it's basically essentially saying, yeah, and wine in the mix makes it even worse because Lot did not know of his daughters lying down with him or getting up. And Moab means potentially means from father, and the other one is Ben-Ami means a son of my people, and it's interesting. So yes, sir?
No, I was just listening. He must have drunk he must have drunk an awful lot of wine, is what I would have to say. Not to know. And the other
blackout.
Yeah, really. And the other thing is that it's not really wine is a problem; it's the wine to excess. Because these guys
even Proverbs talks about don't do this. So like, don't do this. Right. You can't rule.
But it also talks about how wine is good, but not overdo it. Right.
Right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, anything else?
See, that's the question, too. I mean, just a point of interest. Just wondering, where did the wine come from? Where did everything come from?
Right.
They ran out of the city for their lives, or the angels just pulled them out. You know what I mean? They had to have something around, even though this girl said, there's no man in all the earth to come to us. So maybe they of their own caste. But I'm just, it's just a point of interest in my mind that they had something out there.
Yeah, where did they get the wine?
Because, I think they might have got, this is I think this is a moot point. Because when you look at it, they were in Zor, and then they left, because they were afraid of the people there. And the daughters they knew that other people existed, but that they weren't of I guess you could say the breed, quote unquote, that they would want for children. So,
Another thing is they didn't really say how much time passed. It might have been a year or two later, and they had time to make their own wine.
He never does say that. You're absolutely right. Absolutely, yeah. There's things in the details that are lost.
Oh, yeah, I missed the point where they were in Zoar.
They were there, and they left.
Oh, yeah, then they took provisions with them. Yep. Okay, sorry.
And I think it's interesting because I have heard so many explanations over this when it's quite clear that there's a reason why details aren't provided.
Yeah, it's not pertinent to the story. It's what we're just kind of interested as you read this. What are the circumstances? And you don't know for sure. We're just guessing.
I want it. And that's the beauty of modernity.
I missed that.
The beauty of modernity. I want to know.
Inquiring minds.
Yeah, actually, I'm reading a book right now. I was showing it to Linda, and it said it perfectly. But by basically saying, we try to come up with these explanations for things because of our modern rationality and, what was it? Was it exegesis? Or I forget exactly the term that was used, but it was really funny how it was worded. But anyway, let's do a couple more things here before we take a break. So in Genesis 20, verse 10, it was talking about how Abraham once again passed his wife off as his sister. And Abimelech said, "Whatever possessed you to do such a thing?" And Abraham replied, "I thought, this is a godless place. They will want my wife and will kill me to get her. And she really is my sister, for we both have the same father but different mothers, and I married her. When God called me to leave my father's home and to drop from place to place, I told her, do me a favor. Wherever we go, tell the people I'm your brother." Then Abimelech took some of his sheep and goats, and you know the story from there. But it's funny, because Abraham said, I thought this was a godless place, but yet he does a godless thing by telling Abimelech that she's my sister. And winking at you there.
Just like that.
And you're supposed to laugh. So,
I think Abraham just can't learn about certain things. He just figures he's got to maneuver.
right. Right, yeah. So, like, but he's doing it in his own rationale, which is exactly what got him Ishmael in the first place. Like, he's listening to earthly voices in that.
Isn't that basic human nature, though? We try to figure out how to, we have a problem, we try to figure out how to resolve it.
That's exactly it. No, you're not wrong. And that becomes a major theme throughout the other sons, too. Like, it becomes a major biblical theme. But anyway. Anyway, Genesis 21:7. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. So Sarah is lauding herself here. Remember Eve when she did that? Let's remember when she did that with Cain and Abel, and then later on with that she gave thanks to the Lord. She goes, I have done this. And yet here I have given Abraham a son in his old age. What happens directly after that? When Isaac grew up and was about to be weaned, Abraham prepared a huge feast to celebrate the occasion. But Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and her Egyptian servant Hagar, making fun of her son Isaac. So she turned to Abraham and demanded, get rid of that slave woman and her son. She's not going to share the inheritance with my son Isaac. I won't have it. This upset Abraham very much because Ishmael was his son. But God told Abraham, do not be upset over the boy and your servant. Listen to Sarah's voice. And that's literally what the Bible says is listen to Sarah's voice. And it's really fascinating to consider that God here is actually telling Abraham to listen to someone else. And that, go ahead.
I think it's interesting because he listened to her voice when she said, take Hagar. It's like the exact opposite this time. Yeah.
Right. But God told him instead, listen to her voice.
I know.
And then you notice.
It's ironic. That's all I'm saying. It's interesting.
It is ironic. The whole story is ironic. And the whole story is. And so when he says, listen to your wife's voice, notice what happens to Hagar later is not good. Like at first, like she thinks her son's going to die, and then it's really interesting like what happens. So anyway, but God does promise that He will bless Ishmael. And she said in verse 16, she went and sat down by herself about 100 yards away. I don't want to watch the boy die. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God, and here it's definitely God Himself, called to Hagar from heaven. Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well full of water. She quickly filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness. He became a skillful archer, and he settled in the wilderness of Paran. His mother arranged for him to marry a woman from the land of Egypt. I think it's really interesting, the imagery there. Like how I think it's clear. I emphasize these points, but I think it's clear that these little threads are starting to come together in interesting ways and slight nuances. And it's really cool. I'm just making sure that I got everything here. In verse 14 of the same chapter, it says that he sent her away with their son, and she wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. The well was not named yet.
The what?
Just saying. The well, Beersheba, was not named yet.
Oh.
So,
Well, that's just for the modern readers, so you know where the geography is. It's like saying,
right.
it's the equivalent like saying, hey, I was in New York, this so-and-so was born in New York City, even though New York City didn't exist at the time. And it was New Amsterdam.
Right. That is true. You have, Beersheba is interesting because, oh no, sorry, not just Beersheba, I'm sorry, Bethel is a big one. There's like 3 different ways it gets its name.
What's that?
Anyway, there are 3 different stories of how its name is formed. But Bethel, particularly. So we're going to get to that. But yeah, it's interesting. In verse 33, then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he worshipped the Lord. Because it means the well of the oath. And it is interesting. But yeah, in verse 31, it says he named the place Beersheba, well of the oath, because that was where they had sworn the oath. But anyway, let me see. Is there anything else I want to do before we go? We'll just go ahead and take a break now because I have so many notes. I don't care where we end up, but it's so cool and I'm on a roll and it's so fun. Is that okay? I'm gonna stop this recording real quick. We'll come back after the break. Just hang tight, guys. All right, guys. Oh, bless you. All right, guys, and we are back. And so let's go ahead. Starting with Genesis 22. So it's talking about, like, in verse 2 where it says, take your son, your only son. Yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. First of all, Isaac isn't his only son. But here, it's through the covenant, yes. He is his only son. And in verse 4, it says, on the 3rd day of their journey. So we're talking about offering your only son. And on the 3rd day of your journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And they had been walking at that point for 3 days. Or 2 days. And here we go, verses 8 to 12. So when Isaac, yes, Dad? Oh, I guess not.
How about with me sniffing?
Oh, no, his screen was lighting up. That's what I was wondering.
Okay.
So where it says, okay, 1 second. God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son, Abraham answered. And they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told them to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham. I love these responses. They're all, it's like, here I am. So, don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. So you have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket, so he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place, which means the Lord will provide. I don't have the text in here, so I'm not even going to try to pronounce it yet. So to this day, people still use that name as a proverb. On the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven. This is what the Lord said, because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son. I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, all because you have obeyed me. And so I've been emphasizing key points here, and I think the distinction is very clear when you think of Abraham's story versus God's own story, when he wouldn't even withhold his only son. And there's a lot of parallel language here. And it's talking, I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies. When you think of it in the Christian way, the true Christian way of conquering is by serving. But it's true though. Like there's something interesting about being a Christian that like it has that conquering aspect to it. You win people over. It's like that. It's so attractive that you can't help it. You know, I think you're seeing where I'm getting at. And it's really amazing when you look at Abraham, and then it's referenced later in the New Testament, like for example Hebrews, and it's really cool. We're looking at the parallelism there. Does anyone have anything they wanted to talk about when it comes to that particular subject?
I think it's interesting because reading the story of Abraham and his family up to this point, this was a major test for Abraham, I think, in that he finally passed one. A lot of the previous he hasn't passed.
He failed a lot of those. Yeah.
But then he finally came around to saying, okay, I'll trust God. I don't know how he's going to do it, but he'll do it. And that's the amazing. Yeah, it's just interesting, but it shows you how God works with feeble people, people who are not exactly 100%. And God is.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
And when you think of Israel and the things that they went through, and how
Jacob himself,
that the Lord will provide, but in the midst of all this turmoil, they didn't see it. And then the Roman occupation, and then all of these things leading up to Jesus, and then it's so crazy. Like when you think of like how Abraham was tested to that utter point, and what did God do? Back to his covenant promise, he walked through the split animal. He did it instead of Abraham. And
because it's all God. We have a partnership with God, but 99.9999% of it is God's doing. We're just going along for the ride. Basically.
Until we recognize the partnership relationship. I think that's when we're given more choice as well. I equate it to like their child.
But even that, we can't live up to God's standard. We could only do our best.
Oh, of course. No, of course. But yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah, just a point of interest. I think it's kind of fascinating that all this time he's been promising Abraham a son. Abraham has the son, and Isaac probably wasn't real young at this point. You know, I don't think he was really a child, and so he had to go willingly as well. And I think the symbolism there is interesting because he had, he was wondering what was going on, but he went willingly.
Same thing with Jesus.
I don't know that Abraham could have overcome him, to place him on the altar. But anyhow, another thing too is where we started talking about the surrounding cultures, it was not unusual for people to sacrifice their children. And God had started telling Abraham, I'm giving you a son. And all the nations of the world, or the great nation, many, the multitudes of the...
will come to him.
Yeah. As the sand on the seashore will come from this son. And he gave him to him, and then he turns, and he's telling him, I'm different, I am God. And then he says, okay, I'm claiming my right now. And he was claiming, just like the surrounding God, nations and God, he's saying, okay, you can sacrifice your offspring to me now. And it had to be a real major, not just the sacrifice of Isaac would be a blow to Abraham, but the whole idea. He had to feel kind of betrayed at that point. If he didn't totally trust God, he would have really,
that
would
was
have been, I think,
alarm.
a collapse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I just thought it was interesting that given the surrounding culture, that it wasn't unusual to sacrifice children.
Right.
And this was like a real trial for Abraham all the way around.
And when the Israelites actually did start committing child sacrifice, God said, that didn't even cross my mind. Why would you ever do something like that?
Yeah.
And another thing, too, is, like, it's clear, too, that Abraham did trust that something was going to happen because he believed in God's promise. And God didn't want to break his promises. And he could see that by that point. It wasn't like he was trying to, through his own means, get something that God had promised him. God had already promised him this, so he was just letting it happen, transpire in the way that God directed. By that point, his faith was strong enough. And it's definitely indicative because he says it even at the beginning of the chapter. He goes, "We're going to go up and we're going to come back." So it is definitely at that point he knew that the son would survive somehow. So.
A couple of things I was thinking about when both of you guys were talking was that child sacrifice is one thing, but usually the child sacrifices their infants, whereas Isaac wasn't an infant at this time. I think it's pretty obvious because he helped him go up the side of the hill and the mountain. And the other thing is your mother just mentioned, and it just kind of put a little caricature in my head. Can you imagine a 100-year-old guy trying to take a 10-year-old kid or a 20-year-old kid and force him to be sacrificed? Because there was only two of them at that hill, so he had to be willing. If you think about it, even if he was 5 or 6 years old.
So there's a television show that made fun of it. When Abraham and Isaac were on their way down the mountain, and like Abraham's super silent, and then Isaac's like, "So what was all of that about?"
Yeah. No, but I think the point is Isaac had to be a willing sacrifice as well. It's not.
Right.
I could not imagine Abraham being able to wrestle a teenager or a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old to be sacrificed. It's just reading between the lines. And I think that matches Christ's sacrifice because this is a foreshadowing of that. And he was willing.
Right. That's why I thought that was interesting. And what you brought up about the the infant sacrifice would make it doubly as bad because Abraham, this was the total blindside to him.
It was like he had raised a child.
Yeah.
Like the child had his thought.
Exactly. No, I don't disagree with that. So it was
his son.
No, because he had seen him grow.
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Dad, you were saying something and I interrupted.
No, I was agreeing with you.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
I think we're having too much controversy in this study here. We got to stop it.
Right. This is fun. I'm really enjoying myself. Like this is like one of the more animated discussions we've had. Anything else? Chapter 23, it's about Sarah's death, her burial, all that stuff. A lot of like records there, but for what I can see with thread lines, I didn't really see much of anything. I could be wrong. But I just wanted to say we're just going to pass right on to 24. I think it's pretty self-explanatory what 23 is about. In chapter 24, verses 2 to 6. One day, Abraham said to his oldest servant, the man in charge of his household, "Take an oath by putting your hand under my thigh. Swear to the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not allow my son to marry one of those local Canaanite women. Go ahead to my homeland, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son Isaac." The servant asked, "But what if I can't find a young woman who's willing to travel so far from home? Did I then take Isaac there to live among your relatives in the land you came from?" "No," Abraham responded. "Be careful never to take my son there."
Yeah, don't do that.
Well, it's funny because someone does later, but we'll come to that. But anyway, so when it talks about him making an oath under the thigh, the general consensus in terms of scholarly thought is that by putting your hand under the thigh, you also put it under the scrotum, and that that the scrotum rests on the hand. It is usually done, actually it's only done in biblical narrative, when someone's on their deathbed, essentially. When someone's basically going to die soon. This is like a final oath that is done. And so this is like, by the testimony of what is in my hand, I will do what you are having me do. That was a very powerful thing. And once again, I'm going to reiterate, like it's similar to how in English the word testicles is related, is an arguably a cognate with testament, testify, all that stuff. So, all right. So when it says don't marry the, yes, Dan?
I didn't say anything. What verse are you on? I'm trying to find.
So what? What? Oh, it's fine. Okay, cool. All right. So anyway, go where he says, don't marry the local Canaanites. That's huge. Foreshadowing of what the Israelites do. Anyway, so go instead to my homeland, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son Isaac. Henceforth, show and tell. So let's go ahead and take a look at something. Okay, so this is a divided kingdom, and so this is actually, I think we should just do this one. So the journeys of Abraham. Okay, so you got Ur. Arguably, this is where Ur is. It's not 100%. It's not quite certain, but you have the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob here, and so he says, go back to my homeland. What direction is the homeland? From where they're at, they're in the Canaanite area, and he said, go get a wife from here. Go east.
Question, did he go to Ur, or did he go up to Haran?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Yeah, but you're right. You're right. He said go north. Okay, you're right. I'm sorry. That was my mistake.
Confused me for a minute. I thought he went up north to Haran, not to. But
he did, but I was thinking later because something else happened. I was. Wait, where was it? Okay, go to chapter 25, verse 6. This is the reason why I did this. I mixed two things. Go to chapter 25, verse 6. But before he died, he did what?
He sent them eastward.
He sent them east. That's away from Isaac. I'm sorry. That's where I was mixing the two up. You're right. You're right, Dad. He sent someone to say to his servant Haran, but later on he sent his wives and concubines east. And that was my mix up there. But anyway, yeah. So he does say this. Go there. And he said, if I can't find a young woman there, should I take Isaac there to live among your relatives? And he said, no. Never take my son there. Who later ends up going there and living there for a long period of time?
Jake.
Anyone who knows the answer?
Jacob.
Yeah, absolutely, Jacob. He actually does start living there, and he lives there for like 20 years, and it's interesting. We were going to get to the story, but anyway. The rest of the story is... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, flashing back to Lot's situation and his daughters, I wonder if that was the situation too. They didn't want to mix with the locals for some reason. They wanted to go back to their own family. Mm-hmm. Just wondering.
I think it's also too that you get things like such as there was some strife there even before the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing. There's a reason why I forget exactly what, but there was strife. I knew that. Anyway, sorry.
Nothing. I'm turning it down.
Oh, sorry. Then in verse 22. Then at last, when the cannibals had finished drinking, he took out a gold ring for her nose and 2 large gold bracelets for her wrists. I'm just marking it for the cultural impact there, because typically we wouldn't think, especially in modern Christian society, that a nose ring would... Sorry, what?
Sorry.
Okay.
I didn't think there was any sound.
Anyway, sorry. Oh yeah. So when we think of it in our modern Christian concepts, we wouldn't think that that a golden nose ring would be appropriate for a gift, but it's absolutely what was given here. And I do have more stuff here. 1 second. 60. All the way down. I think it's really long-winded, this whole story, because it's like repeated 3 different times. That he goes, I was sent here, this happened, and it just repeats like 3 different times when he recounts this story. But anyway, then they gave her this blessing as she parted. Our sister, may you become the mother of many millions. May your descendants be strong and conquer the cities of their enemies. And that's exactly what happens when you think of it like in a Christian sense as well. We do conquer, but in a way that's not of this world. Then we have here verse 65 and 67. Who was that man? Okay, 65. Who was that man walking through the fields to meet us? She asked the servant, and he replied, it is my master. So Rebecca covered her face with her veil. I'm posing this question to Linda. I don't know if she's able to respond, but does anyone know what that's indicative of, that particular verse there? Who was that man walking through the fields to meet us? She asked the servant, and he replied, it's my master. So Rebecca covered her face with her veil.
What question are you asking?
In chapter 24, verse 65.
Right. Right.
Is it reminiscent of anything else we've been reading? It's when Song of Songs was written, it's a very similar language that's being used here. And it's also indicative of when God was walking through the garden in the evening breeze. And there's a lot of parallelism here. This strong love that one would have for another. This weird pull one would have toward another individual. And the language here is very similar to the woman saying to the daughters of Jerusalem, like, well, who is this man? Oh, no, and actually the daughters of Jerusalem saying, who is that woman? And she has this veil, and the man saying, remove the veil, and all that stuff. And
could it be as something as simple as that was the custom before you met your fiancé that was set up, that you put the veil on until you commence the wedding, probably? I would think it's a custom type thing.
Absolutely. What?
Modesty.
Yeah, it was custom. Yep. And it's yes. And it's interesting because in 67 it says, and Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, and she became his wife. He loved her deeply, and she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother. Remember Genesis 2, when it says, for this reason, a man will leave his mother and cling to his wife. It's very, very much indicative of the same story. And same thing happens too in Song of Songs when they end up under a tree. And it's this, and it's like, oh, come to where your mother gave you birth. Like, let's go to that place. It's a very strong sort of imagery. And yeah, it is paralleled in Song of Songs, absolutely. Anything there?
Yeah, one observation I'm making here, in the Old King James, it's a little bit different than in the New King James that I have in front of me. And in the Old King James, I'm just going to go from memory, starting in verse 64. And then Rebekah lifted up her eyes and saw Isaac afar off, and she lighted off her camel. But here it says she dismounted the camel.
I know what you're saying.
That was an old joke I heard 30 years ago. She saw Jacob afar off and lighted up her camel.
I love it.
Sorry. I better share that.
And I love how, too, she looks up and sees him. That's. But anyway, so chapter 25, verse 6.
I take it you never heard that one before, Joe?
I did. I remember you telling me about this.
Okay.
Just, I wasn't thinking about it.
A long time ago.
When we came across. No, not that long ago, but still, it wasn't fresh in my head. I'll say that. But Genesis 25, verse 6. But before he died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them off to a land in the east, away from Isaac. We've already talked about this. Away from Isaac, too. He didn't want Isaac to have anything to do with them. And it's not really explicit. It's really not explicit because it says at the beginning of 25, Abraham married another wife whose name was Keturah.
Right.
So it doesn't really say much of anything negative. He just didn't want them to have anything to do with his son.
Abraham left everything he owed to Isaac.
Right.
It's interesting, too, if you look at those children, the other children of Abraham, they constantly had interactions with Israel the rest of their history. The Midianites is one of them. Some of the other ones as well.
Ether, Hanok, Abida.
And it's an interesting line, and it's interesting how it just keeps going back to these lists. That was a very important concept, were these genealogies and where people came from. And so, all right, so we are done with Abraham. And now we are moving on to the story arc of Isaac. And verse 21. Remember the strong love between Rebekah and Isaac. It's like idyllic, the love that they have for one another. And in verse 21, Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer and Rebekah became pregnant instead of what Sarah did when she saw that she couldn't, she just gave Hagar because she thought that was the wisest thing to do. But clearly here, what Isaac does, and it's reminiscent too of what Mom was talking about, like with Abraham and Isaac Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac. Isaac was also faithful here, and instead of doing what he thought would be fit, what he actually did see fit was to pray to God and to intercede on Rebekah's behalf. And God heard the prayer, and she did give birth. And that is, anyway, so we're talking about the whole, and then Rebekah goes to God and says, why is there this strife within my womb? And the story is relatively self-explanatory. And so when that whole thing happens and a child is born holding on to the other one's heel. Remember what the snake, what God told the snake in Genesis 3.
You will strike the heel of man.
You will bruise his heel and he will crush your head. And I told you before what grasping the heel means. In actually, the word Jacob can actually mean heel, and it also means to follow someone. To, like, for example, we heel someone. Like, we could say that too. Like, I follow closely behind. It can also mean to deceive someone, and the trickery, cunning. That's weird. Like a snake, right? Jacob is more often like the snake here than he is like an Adam figure. So this is huge here, and this is a major point that God talks about. Like basically saying you weren't any great figure. You're kind of like a creep. And Jacob is very deceitful, very much like a snake. Yes, Dad?
It's interesting. You kind of wonder why God chose Jacob over Esau. Because I think Esau had his issues, but I think Jacob had a slew of them.
Right. Esau did have his issues, and the number one was in verse 27, where it says, as the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so think of even modern society. What is like a father conceiving of a son? What is the modern day ideal of having a son? Outdoorsmanship?
Mm-hmm.
That willingness to go out and get your own meat and put your own stuff on the table, that type of mentality, that's exactly what Esau was. He was the epitome of masculinity, and not in a negative way either. It's just he was the epitome of masculinity. In other cultures, they were also, I think with Babylon, had two gods that were known for their hairiness and for their very, and that hairiness was a sign of masculine trait. And it's and so to be hairy was a valued trait as well. And but another thing is the strangeness of the hairiness, though, in the story, especially when it comes to Jacob wearing goat's fur. That's more than normally hairy, and that's also indicative of Esau's animalistic behavior. And we were talking before how the Bible often makes a reference to what it means to be like an animal. Remember when the Israelites eat meat without cooking it, they were acting like animals. You have the concept, but here, Jacob is also acting like an animal, but in this crafty way. And it's getting back to that concept of where the Bible is getting to a convoluted state, where it's like, what good is coming from any of this? Like, God's plan is being worked through all of it,
right,
but not in the best of any condition. So, get them?
Yeah. I think it's interesting what you were saying there. Was that I wonder if Esau was mutant or something because of all the fur he had instead of hair. If he was like a sheep. I'm just
what?
kidding. If Esau was like a sheep, as far as his hair and body hair was concerned, is he some kind of a mutant? I don't think that was the case. I think it was just imagery.
I'll tell you this. It's funny that the word Esau can potentially mean pursuit. And it's funny that similar letters are used for that.
I'm sorry. You broke up, Joel. Say that again about Esau's name is what?
Esau in Hebrew, it can potentially mean pursuit. Very hairy. And then Edom. Here, H-I-R-S-U-T-E. You don't know that word?
That's where we get Harry from, right?
Yes.
Hairsuit. H-A-I-R.
H-I-R.
Oh, hirsute.
Huh. Yeah, it means her suit, hairy. Her suit chests. Yep.
Huh.
Yep. Yeah, so it's H-I-R. And you have, but it's similar. So you basically say, like, Esau is like naming a guy her suit. Or like, but Edom is based on the word for red. It's both. And it's really interesting. And don't say Eric the Red Dead. So,
yeah, but if Esau might have just had red hair and hairy red hair.
Yeah. And it's interesting about the weird animalistic nature of that, right? It's almost like an ape man. So it's interesting. And so like an ape, he came in, he was famished, and he was like, I don't care anymore, give me this meat. And he wolfed it down. In the Hebrew language, it's very indicative of just gobbling like an animal. Mm-hmm. And it's cool. And he didn't care anything about this firstborn stuff. He just wanted the food.
Yep.
And that's really, really fascinating when you get into it. So, and Jacob got him through deceit. There is no good situation here. So and I love how the Bible is not pulling any punches when it comes to that. All right, 26, 7 to 11. 26, 7. When the men who lived there asked Isaac about his wife Rebecca, he said, "She's my sister." He was afraid to say she's my wife. He thought they'll kill me to get her because she's so beautiful. So it's interesting how quickly Isaac changed from interceding on Rebecca's behalf to open her womb. And now he's becoming afraid of earthly things. And it's really interesting that he himself is becoming denigrated. Would that be the word? Like he's going downhill in a sense. It's like, yeah, and he's not the promised one. And that happens a lot in the Bible. It's like, is Abraham the one? No, not quite. Is Isaac the one? No, no, no. Is Jacob? Absolutely not. But through that, God makes his plan clear. Anyway. So, but sometime later, anyway, so what? She's obviously your wife. I saw you doing some obvious PDA out there, and so.
I'm wondering why these men keep lying.
That's the point. That's the whole point of it all. It's like, why? If they truly trust in the Lord, why do they lie in this? And he said, "How could you do this to us? One of my people might easily have taken your wife." And he issued a public proclamation: "If you touch this woman, you will die." So it's interesting with that. All right, 33. I have 33. Oh, so Isaac named the well Oath, and to this day, the town that grew up there is called the Well of the Oath. Wasn't there a story about Abraham making a place called Beersheba?
Mm-hmm.
And wasn't there? And so it's strange that there's another story about this Beersheba. Interesting, I think. I don't have an explanation for it. I just think it's to point it out. There are two stories of the same place being called Beersheba. And
it says he called them by the names which his father had called them.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, like he called it an oath because of what? They had an oath earlier. Mm-hmm. So it's like he continued on the name. But it's interesting that it's like two restatements of that. But anyway, fascinating to me. All right, 35. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. Now notice here, it's also making a statement about Esau's animalistic behavior by him taking many wives for himself. Abraham did too, don't get me wrong, but it is clearly making the distinction that Isaac married one, and there's like that whole imagery of being in the garden in that Song of Songs type of feel. Like it's the two shall cling to one another. But yet here's Esau seeing a woman and taking one for himself. And these wives, similarly to what happened between Sarah and Hagar, were causing strife between Isaac and Rebekah. And don't get me wrong, Isaac and Rebekah aren't perfect either, but there was that weird strife coming from that. Sorry.
I think there might have been a thing there too because of the fact that they were Hittite women, and I think there was a natural problem with that culturally, or maybe because of their religion or their ethnicity, and I think that's kind of what their problem was with them, and because Jacob went to his parents' or his grandparents' place to pick up wives of his second cousins or whatever.
Right. No, you're not wrong.
But I think they didn't want to mix with the people in the land. I think a lot of it had to do with their idolatry and stuff.
Yeah. But it also says that Esau was quite aware that he shouldn't take women that Isaac did not want. It does state that.
Yeah. I think it did that. He realized that he upset his parents later on, so he married some other women to make him happy. He thought that would improve the situation.
That's potential. Yeah, I do see that. I think it's clear there. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. No disagreement. All right, 27:1. One day when Isaac was old and turning blind, he called for Esau, his oldest son. Yeah, did I hear you go?
Yeah, the blindness. Yeah.
Yeah. This is starting to really make things a lot more interesting when you look at it through the eyes that we've been talking about, from the very beginning. So, one day when Isaac was old and turning blind, he called for Esau, his older son, and said, so it's going, he wants the meat, all that stuff. And then the whole thing with Jacob, right, is go out to the flocks doing two things, blah, 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 blah. Verse 11. But look, Jacob replied to Rebekah, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and my skin is smooth. Okay? And then you have, we already talked about the implications of that. Verse 22. So Jacob, we already know the story. So verse 22. So Jacob went closer to his father, and Isaac touched him. The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's, Isaac said. But he did not recognize Jacob. So this is, just think of it through what we've been talking about. The voice, he's listening to Jacob's voice. Even though he doesn't know it, he's listening to his voice. And so this is so cool to me. And then 28 and 29, where it says, when he gives him the blessing, from the dew of heaven, think of later stories, and the richness of the earth. May God always give you abundant harvests of grain and bountiful new wine. May many nations become your servants, and may they bow down to you. May you be the master over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. All who curse you will be cursed, and all who bless you will be blessed. It's really interesting how that comes into fruition when you think of the entire biblical narrative. And thinking godly terms, because it's strange, because Jacob's extremely deceitful, but yet God makes this happen. It's interesting. Verse 36. Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob, for now he has cheated me twice. First he took my rights as the firstborn, and now he's stolen my blessing. Haven't you even 1 second blessing for me? And that's really, really, really cool imagery. 39 to 40, okay. Finally, his father Isaac said to him, you will live away from the richness of the earth and away from the dew of the heaven above. You will live by your sword. Remember when Christ says, all those who live by the sword will die by it. And you will, and remember Lamech, the song of the sword. And you will serve your brother. But when you decide to break free, Perez, when you decide to break free, you will shake his yoke from your neck. And think of Christ when he says, I get rid of the yoke that you have because I offer something better. My yoke is not as much of a burden. It's really, really, really interesting groundwork being laid here. Verse 41. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. Think of Cain here. He thought that Jacob got the blessing, not Esau. Esau was jealous. So he planned, I will soon be mourning my father's death, and then I'll kill my brother Jacob. So this is a repetition of Genesis 4 here, and or at least in a similar light. And verse 43. So Rebekah's saying, listen carefully, my son. Get ready and flee to my brother Laban in Haran. What did Abraham specifically tell his servant not to do?
Send his son to Haran.
Yep, but yet his grandson goes. Yep. And yet because he listens to his mother's voice.
Yep.
It's so cool.
Who was from also, who she was from there as well.
True. But the thing is, though, she said, listen to me. And, like, this is very clear here.
It's interesting, too, is that Rebecca was just as deceitful as Jacob.
Right. Right.
And,
Exactly.
And if you think about Laban later on, he's deceitful as well. They come from a family of deceitful people.
It gets crazy. When you think about what Laban and Jacob and Rebecca, all of it, all together, by the time Joseph comes around, so we're already getting into this convoluted state into the what is right category anymore. What good is there anymore? And this whole series of, like, family strife, it gets so crazy.
Rachel is people too.
Oh, yeah, Rachel, like, oh yeah, totally. Yeah, the mandrake thing. My goodness, it goes down to mandrake.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. Stealing the idols.
Oh no, we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there.
No, but my point was it's a family trait. It seems like on the mother's side there, especially.
Right.
Just what I'm thinking here is, and because when Jacob goes and spends time with his uncle and finds out what a shyster he is too, and learns a lot of good things from him.
Oh, it gets interesting because in preview coming attractions, but Jacob is like, didn't I do all this for you, and I did this, and blah, 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 and he doesn't notice any of the negative traits there?
Yep.
Anyway.
I kind of wonder.
Yes?
I kind of wonder if maybe that's why Isaac loved Esau. Because not just because he was a man's man, but because he was straightforward.
Yeah, what you see is what you get.
It's true.
He may have liked his character as opposed to. I mean, he had a lack of character too because he would sell his birthright for some soup.
And Isaac had lack of character too when he said that this is his sister.
Right, exactly. But
when you compare,
he was probably more straightforward, and Isaac may have appreciated that.
Yes, that's
right. Well, what I'm wondering too is, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. I think Esau's only real fault was that he treated lightly the birthright and the blessing. Other than that, he had really no faults that are brought out in the narrative here. But Jacob, how many faults did Jacob have in comparison?
In the biblical eyes, there are faults with Esau. His animalistic behavior is clear.
Okay.
And it's clear that God calls us not to be animalistic and to not praise animalistic behavior because he also lives by the sword in that sense.
Yeah, yeah.
He lives by killing things instead of, like, remember, he's a huntsman. He goes out to kill things. And God himself says, that's not my ideal plan. But it's not saying that he doesn't love Esau or something like that, but it is saying that in the biblical eyes, this is why this whole thing is about through the eyes of the scribes here, Jacob is more of the shyster, like you were talking about, and Esau is the one, Esau is the animal, and the two are put it on.
Right.
So, and it's interesting because it's also a direct refute to the culture of the time that kind of was divided on the ideal form of masculinity versus the, like, I can get what I want through playing games, and it's that narrow path between them, and anything else?
Nope.
Okay. Chapter 28, verses 8 to 9. It was now very clear to Esau that his father did not like the local Canaanite women. So Esau married. Oh, by the way, not to mention the last verse of the previous chapter is like when Rebecca said to Isaac, "I'm sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them." But anyway, but Esau realized that it wasn't good to marry the Canaanite women, so he visited his uncle Ishmael's family. They married one of Ishmael's daughters, in addition to the wives he already had. His new wife's name was Mahlah. and she was sister of Nebaioth, and the daughter of Ishmael, Abram's son. So anyway, I think that's really interesting. That might be a good place to stop because we're about to,
Well, so what we're saying here is that he married his cousin.
Right.
Ishmael would have been Abraham's daughter, right? Ishmael, so one of his kids, so that would probably be a second cousin at least, if not closer.
Yes,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'll say this. We'll finish with the end of 28 here. Okay, so the whole dream thing at Bethel, the Jacob's ladder, the whole thing. And it's funny because like this is the Lord God saying, "Hey, I'm going to bless you through you. You're gonna have my covenant is going to be maintained through you, and you know, I'm with you. I am Emmanuel, basically. I will protect you. I will protect you wherever you go. One day I'll bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I've finished giving you everything I promised you. No matter what you do, it's going to happen." Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I wasn't even aware of it." But he was also afraid and said, "What an awesome place this is. It is none other than the house of God, the very gateway to heaven." The next morning, Jacob got up very early. He took the stone he had rested his head against, and he set it upright as a memorial pillar. Then he poured olive oil all over it. He named the place Bethel, which is house of God, although it was previously called Luz. Then Jacob made this vow: "If God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, if God's going to do this for me, if he does this, and if I return safely to my father's home, then he will be my God." He just has this ground-shaking vision that normally, when you look at it anywhere else, except for like Abraham, but like pretty much anywhere else, people are like struck dead by like when they see like these great, amazing visions. And here's Jacob going, if these things happen, then he'll be my God. And this is the beginning of his struggles with God here.
Yeah,
and this will become a place.
It's like he's negotiating with God for a contract here.
Right. And this memorial pillar I have set up will become a place for worshiping God. And I will present to God a tenth of everything he gives me, but only when these things are taken care of. How often do we do this with God as well? Like especially early on. If you do this, then you'll be God. It's interesting. Sorry. It's interesting. I think that's a good place to stop for tonight. Yeah. Yeah, I am really excited where this is going. Any final comments before we shut it down?
I think it's interesting to be able to read through this and not take a side necessarily, but just see what the text is saying. Not have an agenda on the thing. It's interesting.
Yeah, it really is different, isn't it? Because I have definitely experienced like where it's like, oh, you really want to side with Jacob on these things.
You want to, you have the heroes, right? You're trying to back and support, but yeah.
Right, and it's because like of course God promised this to Jacob, so why shouldn't we support him, right? And it's like no, he does some really shady things.
That's right.
Same thing with Esau as well, like how they saw it as like the modern. The universal concept of what masculinity is all about is like that the Bible actually shies away from that as well. It's like that's not necessarily what's godly. It can be, but not the animalistic traits behind it.
Right,
and that's exactly what Jude writes. What?
So that's when you go to the extremes is the problem. It's okay to be masculine, hunting and stuff like that, but not necessarily to be an animal about it. You don't want to abase yourself.
Absolutely, and I think this is exactly where it talks about the narrow path, because don't go to the right and don't go to the left.
That's right.
Here we see the right and this is us actually experiencing like, okay, there is a narrow path that God is presenting here, but that narrow path is extremely narrow.
Yep. So, the gate is narrow, and few there be that find it.
All right, guys, you ready? We'll go ahead and give it to him.
Sure.
Yep, you good? You said yes? Okay, I wasn't sure. It sounded like you were saying something. All right, I'll go ahead and we'll just go ahead and give it to him. Lord God, thank you. This is just, I'm pumped. Like, it's so clear, these little threads. And this is just the first book. I am like seriously in amazing expectation of what's going to happen when we get into the books that were clearly written later. And oh my goodness, it's so cool just to see like all these things and to see your narrow path and what you're calling us to is clear, but it's so much against the way we typically act. And it's so much against our basic of instincts. Do we listen to these animalistic instincts, or do we try to connive our way through things like serpents? Father, we just put our hands up to you and open ourselves up to you, because we honestly were not able to find a good way ourselves. And we know that it's only through your guidance and teaching that we can actually hope to ever join you in partnership. Father, it is so awesome to be able to go through this journey with my brothers and sisters. It is so much an honor to see how well it's received by everyone who's been watching as well. This is just really cool, and I'm excited for where we're going with this. Father, it's clear that you want this to continue, and I just put my hands up to you and just thank you. We just ask your hand of grace as we go about our ways, just as always. May you continue to open our minds and hearts. And may we always see what you want us to see and hear the voice that you want us to hear. Father, we thank you. In the name of Jesus Christ, the one whom you sacrificed, your Son, your only Son. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
So, it's cool, like all this stuff. So, all right, I'm going to close the recording here.